section 2.1. So there's two key concepts. Here's the first one, is that what are the subatomic particles that make up atoms? And we have 3 protons, neutrons, and electrons. So key concepts, definitely need to write that down. Moving on, what is an atom? Atoms, we know, are the basic unit of matter. Everything is made of atoms. Even cells are made of atoms. Where did the word atom come from? Well, it came from a Greek philosopher who thought that there was a point where you could not divide a substance any farther. So you would cut something in half, and then half again, and then half again, and eventually you would have this small fragment that you could not divide anymore. And he used the word atom. It came from the Greek word atomos, and the Greek word atomos means unable to cut. So that's where he got the word atom from. Atoms are incredibly small. So if you place 100 million atoms side by side, they would make a row only as wide as your little finger. So even though they are incredibly small, they are still made of protons, neutrons, and electrons. First, we'll talk about protons and neutrons. Protons and neutrons have almost the same mass, so very similar in mass. Protons are positively charged, so they have a positive charge. Protons are positive. Neutrons have no charge. Neutrons are neutral, so neutrons, neutral. The protons and neutrons are combined together in the nucleus, right? The nucleus of the atom is in the center of the atom, and they're held together there. The third subatomic particle would be the electron. The electron is negatively charged, so whereas positive protons, electrons are the negative charge. They have a very, very small mass compared to protons and neutrons. They are 1/1840th the mass of a proton, so a much smaller mass. I like to compare protons and electrons to elephants and peanuts. So if a proton has the mass of a proton would have the mass of an elephant, whereas an electron would have the mass of a peanut. So almost insignificant compared to protons and also the neutrons. These electrons are found outside the nucleus, out here in the electron cloud region, and they are in constant motion around the nucleus. In terms of number of protons and electrons, atoms will have equal numbers. So protons have a positive charge. We will have the number of protons is going to equal the number of electrons that are negatively charged. So they're equal so that the positive charges and the negative charges balance out, and atoms are overall neutral. The next key concept is that atoms have what we call isotopes. And isotopes of an element all have the same chemical properties, which means they react in the same way, and they make the same compounds and do the same things in chemical reactions, but there's only one small difference, and that's what we're going to talk about. So before we talk about isotopes, let's talk about elements. Elements are pure substances. These pure substances consist of only one kind of atom. So this is an example of the element mercury, one of the few liquid elements. And every single atom in here is a mercury atom. There's not anything else there. There are more than 100 elements known, 118 to be exact. There's only about 24 commonly found in living organisms, so those will be the ones we focus on in biology. All elements are represented by a symbol. The symbol is either 1 or 2 letters in length. So here's an example. C is for carbon, H for hydrogen. Na is the symbol for the element sodium. The element sodium gets its symbol from the Latin word. The Latin word for sodium is natrium. So that's where the Na comes from. But we'll just learn what those symbols are, and that's good enough. There's important numbers that we need to be aware of and be able to talk about when we're talking about atoms and elements. And the first one is the atomic number. The atomic number tells us the number of positive, not neutral, positive protons in the nucleus. So if I look here at this element over here, I see that it has 6 protons, and that will then tell me that this element is carbon, because the atomic number is is how we identify an element. Here's another example. This is an example of a square that would have come off of a periodic table. So this square came from the periodic table, and this number right here would be the atomic number. It tells us that silver has 47 protons. So it's the smallest. There's always 2 numbers on the periodic table. The smallest number is a whole number, and that is the atomic number. Whereas all elements have the same number of protons, sometimes atoms can have different number of neutrons. When an atom has different numbers of neutrons, we call those isotopes. So when we look here, here's 3 isotopes of the element carbon. The first, they all have the same number of protons. You can see that. But when I look over here at neutrons, you can see that they have different numbers of neutrons. The first isotope has 6 neutrons, the next one has 7 neutrons, and the third one has 8 neutrons. We identify isotopes by looking at their mass number. Their mass number is the total number of protons and neutrons. So we look at the number of positive protons, and then we add that to the number of neutrons that have no charge, and then that equals the mass number. So if you know two of the 3 things, you could find the other one. So here's the example. I have 6 protons and 6 neutrons, and so we call this carbon 12. It has a mass number of 12. Here's second isotope has 6 protons. This one has 7 neutrons. 6 and 7 is 13, so that makes carbon 13. The last isotope, 6 and 8, makes 14, carbon 14 isotopes. The third number that you need to know about on an element is called the atomic mass. The atomic mass is an average of all of the isotopes, but it also takes into account how frequently or how abundant that isotope is. So for example, those carbon isotopes, we had carbon 13, carbon 12, and carbon 13, and then carbon 14. We had those 3 isotopes, and if we were to average their mass, we know that just by looking at it, the average would be 13. However, when we take into account how frequently each of the isotopes occurs, this isotope, carbon 12, is much more abundant than anything else. So we have a small amount of 13 and a small amount of carbon 14. So the chances are that if I picked up an atom of carbon, it would probably have a mass closest of carbon 12, and it's not likely that I would grab one of these because there's very small amounts of these. So when I find the atomic mass, or the weighted average for carbon, it's actually known as 12.01 is the average atomic mass of carbon, because the abundance of carbon 12 is so much higher than all the other isotopes. Here's a silver example we had earlier. Remember, this number was the atomic number. Now this number, the 107, this would be known as the atomic mass. This is the average mass of all of the isotopes, taking into account which ones are the most abundant. Another thing to remember is that, here's our key concept again, is that all elements have the same number of electrons, and because electrons determine how an atom reacts. So therefore, because they have the same number of electrons, all of the isotopes have the same chemical properties. So what is different about isotopes? So why do we care? So if they all have the same chemical properties and react the same, what do we really care about? What we do care about is because some of the isotopes are radioactive. It's the radioactive isotope for carbon that we've been talking about is carbon-14. It has 6 protons and then it has 8 neutrons. So those extra neutrons, it had 2 more neutrons than the first carbon isotope. This causes the nucleus to be unstable and then break down over time. And as it breaks down, it gives off radiation. And so there are some uses for radiation. It helps us to determine how old rocks and fossils are. Carbon dating, as it's called. And then another thing, it can be used to treat cancer. So radiation treatments treat cancer. Uses these different radioactive isotopes. Other radioactive isotopes are used to kill bacteria in food. Some meat especially is irradiated, and it helps reduce the spoilage and also reduce the likelihood that you'll get food poisoning. And then we can also use them to help trace substances within organisms. So how does certain things react within a body or a living organism? And that's one thing to consider. All right, that's the first part of section 1.